上に上がりゃ関係ねえ。Shall we begin? The winter is coming. I can do this all day.
Tear down this wall.
行くぞ。
Ikuzo means let's go, and here we come powered by Jägermeister. And our guest, coming straight out of Wisconsin, 3 years ago he got his PhD in paleobiology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. With his detailed and rigorous skeletal reconstructions and Da Vincian approach to anatomy, he's your go-to guy if you're looking for precise, anatomically correct work. Science, TV, movies, art and design, he has done it all. And spoiler alert, he will reignite your passion for the dinosaur world. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Scott Hartman, paleobiologist and paleoartist, current associate professor of anatomy. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
Yeah, you're good as well. So, good to meet you. So, for the beginning, let me ask you how you got interested into the dinosaur world and how you became what you are today.
Oh, wow, that's a big question. I mean, honestly, I was like one of those kids who always liked dinosaurs growing up. Like other kids wanted to be firefighters or astronauts. I kind of wanted to be an astronaut for a while, but the odds of being a paleontologist actually seemed better, I think. And I just never really grew up, I guess. I don't know what's wrong with those other kids. So I just kind of kept doing what I loved to do. And I was fortunate enough to be able to make a living doing it until I, went back to grad school and now make a living also doing it. So,
yeah, simple story. And let me ask you, I had an honor of seeing a Archaeopteryx fossil when I was in Vienna. And as far as I know, Archaeopteryx is the earliest known evidence of avian flight dating from the Jurassic period. What is your take on why did the evolution of the dinosaur took this path? What was the primary reason for it? Obviously survival, but why I'm interested in this is because this kind of evolution at such scale never occurred with mammals, with exception of bats.
Yeah, I mean, actually, bringing up bats is a really good analogy. One thing historically that's made dinosaurs seem, or I should say, has made birds seem very different from other dinosaurs was that we honestly just had cultural conceptions of them as very different. Dinosaurs spent much of the last century as being sluggish, overgrown lizard-like animals that were just waiting for extinction. In fact, the whole sort of post-World War II age of technological optimism purposely viewed them that way, that there were things that didn't change fast enough and went extinct, and then other cool things that became mammals or birds. But the reality, as we learn more and more about the distribution of feathers, of wings, and proto-wings, is that almost everything we associate with birds that today makes them seem different and unique had evolved in other forms already before birds evolved, to the point where we can debate whether Archaeopteryx is really even something we should call a bird, or if it's just a pretty typical small feathered dinosaur from the time, and to what degree of flight it had. And don't get me wrong, you can find paleontologists who would agree exactly with your statement that it was kind of one of the earliest forms of avian flight, and others would be like, maybe not so much flying. But the reality is, today, if you look at bats, they seem connected to mammals, right? We see other things that look furry like bats. You see little rodents, and bats kind of look like rodents with wings. You see flying lemurs, which aren't really lemurs and only glide, but which look like proto-bats very much, even though they're not literally ancestors. They just kind of do something, similar to what the ancestors of bats might have done. But you can see all these living members, and so bats feel connected. And with all the other dinosaurs gone, and us not really thinking of dinosaurs having feathers and other types of skin, coverings, it feels like there's this bigger leap. But if you were alive in the Cretaceous, or I guess you took a time machine to the Cretaceous, don't step on any butterflies while you're there, you would not feel that way. It would seem that birds are very connected to all the various feathered meat-eating dinosaurs running around, many of which had wings for reasons that are completely unconnected to flight. And so that's what's hard, is most of the features of birds evolved for other purposes and were exapted later. Exaptation is like adaptation, except you're not creating something new for a new purpose. You're modifying a structure that already exists, right? So you're like fixing the damn plane or modifying it while you're flying, so to speak. Or you're driving your car really fast and climbing out on the hood and changing something, regapping the spark plugs as you go. And those kinds of changes are, of course, highly constrained, but they also are sort of challenging to reconstruct from our point of view 150 million years later. But exciting.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I read on your website, and I quote, that all parsimonious results support the hypothesis that each early Peruvian clade was plesiomorphically flightless, raising the possibility that avian flight originated as late as the late Jurassic or early Cretaceous. What does that actually mean? Does that rule out a possibility between us, the possibility to find older avian specimen than Archaeopteryx?
So actually, it would argue for sort of the opposite. So human beings have a tendency, I like to call it tyranny of the present. Obviously we live in the world we live in, right? We can't live in any other world. We're kind of trapped right now. And I like being here, so I'm not complaining, but but as a result, like, we tend to view the sequence of historical events coming up to us as leading to us. And in some literal sense, that's true, but that often makes it easy to over-interpret or extend interpretations of things getting like closer to the modern era when we should. Now, let me give you a parallel example. The origin of vertebrates moving from fish-like animals onto land. There's long been a habit of people looking at things that clearly spent essentially their whole lives in the water, but interpreting how they might have gotten out on land with those features. If you look at a lot of textbooks in like biology or paleontology, you'll see a bony lobe-finned fish. Lobe-finned just means it has bones and muscles in its fins, called Eusthenopteron. And it very clearly was a, fish. It swam in the water, probably most of them all of their lives. But because it's one of the earliest identifiable members that was discovered, that's closer to the animals that end up living on land than like the fish that led to trout, for example, or salmon. If you look at textbooks, you always see pictures of them like hauling themselves out on land and their little fishy bodies with their like fins and like planting the flag and claiming it for Spain or something. I don't know. But probably almost no Eusthenopterons ever did that. The transition to literally spending time out of the water on land probably happened much later. And as it turns out, paleontologists like Jenny Clack have shown that like early fingers and toes probably evolved for being better at living in the water at the time, in shallow water where they could hold on and not disturb the water. But because we know the end of the story, that they get on land, it's very tempting to repeatedly interpret every little thing as getting closer to the end of the story rather than actually evolving for some other local purpose at the time. So now let me apply that to birds and what I wrote. Because we know how it ends up, right? With robins and eagles and all these cool birds today, it's very easy to interpret every little change we see that leads to birds as inherently getting them ready for flight, rather than as exaptations, things that had other purposes that were then later used for flight. And so many people, since Archaeopteryx has been found, have looked at like every little detail and ignored perhaps other missing pieces of anatomy and been like, oh, see, already early flight. They had feathers, must have flown. They had wings, must have flown. But now we know that there are lots of uses that wings can give you besides just flight before you get all the other anatomical components necessary to fly. They can help you regulate the temperature of your nest, which is a big deal. If a bunch more of your babies live to grow up, that is a heck of an evolutionary advantage. They can be used for display. Everyone likes to look sexy, and wings and feathers are one of the ways you can do that. They can, if you're small enough and you have big enough arms, you can use them to help flap to maintain balance while you're running around, especially with the sort of stiff legs that dinosaurs have compared to mammals. If you're a predator and you're landing on animals, you can flap them to help keep yourself stable on a squirming animal as you bend down to eat it. That's called raptor prey restraint. If you get big enough and powerful enough wings, something very close to what would make flight possible, you could use them to help do things like run faster along the ground or squirt up for, either trying to catch prey or get away from something that would like to nibble on you more effectively. So there's all these other things that can be done. And so what I was arguing with that paper and my co-authors was that we need to actually test where does flight show up. And ironically, although some have argued that maybe every winged dinosaur descended from a flying ancestor in the past, what our study found was very little evidence of that. All the major clades of winged dinosaurs have very clearly primarily flightless members at their base, which means that you probably had a whole bunch of very near birds that weren't really flying, and that actually true avian flight might not have even appeared in Archaeopteryx. It could have been later in the early Cretaceous, potentially. And when I say this, I don't mean nothing was flying, because like Microraptor seems to be doing some sort of, is a little relative of Velociraptor with wings on his hands and actually on his legs too. Seems to be doing some sort of maybe running, flapping up trees and leaping out to land on things to kill them or whatever. But they seem to have acquired that independently, which is really cool. It seems that once you get small and have wings, it's not that hard to get some sort of primitive flight, and it might have happened 2 or 3 times, with only one of them actually leading to birds.
Yeah, it's like, are you like basically saying that because we have a perception of now wings as a means to fly, that we also see the development of wings just in case for that, but it could be multiple uses.
Yep, that's exactly right, yeah. It seems like it must be for flight, but in reality, we now know there's a lot of reasons why wings evolved, and we know that they preceded, like, even Archaeopteryx and stuff phylogenetically, so they clearly evolved for other purposes and then were modified, adapted for flight more than once.
So why the flight happens, do you think?
Well, that's an interesting question. It may well be that wing-assisted incline running, not as far down as maybe the original authors thought, but at the level of like Archaeopteryx or even the slightly more bird-like animals, was a major feature. Landing in trees is hard, and climbing trees for dinosaurs would have been stupid hard because basically all their joints fold the wrong way.
Yeah.
Animals like squirrels or monkeys, that climb, they can usually do this really well, right? They can be like, I don't know. I can whirl my hands around because I have limbs that can do that. The most bird-like dinosaurs and birds tend to have ones that can only kind of fold up, like the way wings fold up now, with very little motion around the other axes, which is a terrible way to climb anything. Like if you were going to try to even use your claws to grab on, you'd rather than pulling yourself up, you'd be pulling yourself into the trunk as hard as you can, which wouldn't be terribly great. And so one advantage of near flight might have actually been being able to walk up in trees. Even today, like young birds who granted have even more advanced features for flight, can actually walk up essentially vertical surfaces by flapping their wings and sticking themselves to it. So that somewhere early in this transition, they were able to open up living in trees. Well, that was a place where dinosaurs worked, right? Which means safety from other dinosaurs, maybe some more mammals to nibble on, or perhaps by then, maybe not so many pterosaurs, but whatever's up there, lizards. You find like a whole new ecosystem, and you would expect them, if that were true, to have bursted into this new set of niches to fill, right? An environment. And of course, one of the things that makes setting early birds and their relatives so hard is they do this bursting into species. This huge flowering right there at the end of the Jurassic, early Cretaceous. And at that point, flight is merely a series of stages. Once you can wear up something, you can certainly jump from the tree down safely, right? Whether it's good gliding or just controlled landing on something. And that gives you lots of opportunities. You could become a dedicated glider, or you could try doing something else. Probably dedicated gliders don't become flapping animals too often, because when you're a glider, going fast and having reduced drag lets you glide further, right? When you flap the first time, you actually increase drag, and you pretty much make yourself a bad glider. So probably you either go one way or the other, which is why there's so many gliders and only like 3 groups of vertebrates have learned to have ever evolved flight. At least that's stuck with it. But once you have flight's fantastic. It can be very efficient, especially if you're good at soaring. Some authors think that some of the early birds were soarers, although that's controversial with some workers. which would let you travel long distances cheaply. And that's always good, right? Saving energy is great. That's why I take a card when I scavenge at McDonald's.
Yeah.
Right? We all like to save energy. Of course, flight makes you safe from a lot of things on the ground. There were pterosaurs in the air, so it wasn't a complete form of safety, but probably was relative safety. And just once you get good, you can travel long distances. But I should again caution that all these early bird-like animals we're talking about were probably not very good at flying south for the winter, if at all. Because there were a whole bunch of other changes much closer to modern birds. Long after everyone would say, "Oh, that's a bird." Like when I see it, maybe it has teeth, but it can fly a ways and it's very birdy. There were still things that had to change in their organization to allow their high-end breathing systems, their cardiovascular systems, to work while they were vigorously flapping their wings. Or that included losing their belly ribs, making they have giant plates. If you ever like the breast meat on a turkey or chicken, like all that muscle there on the breastplate, those are hinged. The bones are to help ventilate or open and close the air sacs at the front of the torso. And then they have a whole other set of air sacs, kind of butt air sacs, if you will, under their legs that are ventilated by other muscles. And all those can happen independently of whether they're flapping or not. Because, of course, when you're flapping, you're compressing your rib cage, right? And if you don't have all these specializations, it may be difficult to fly for long periods of time and still get enough oxygen to maintain indefinite flight, the way like robins do in North America when they go south for the winter, or orioles or crows do everywhere.
Yeah, as we can see, macroevolution is much debated, and it's not a rare case to find a new fossil specimen which breaks down theories which are standing for decades. So let me ask you this: are there any chances that wings, because we are talking about wings and flight now, occurred at the species level, that genetic drift happened? I'm not sure if I'm using the term genetic drift correctly. I hope I do, but is there a role of mutation in fly-wing evolution?
Absolutely. I mean, and yeah, genetic drift is any non-adaptive change, so you were using it correctly. So the question you're essentially asking is like how rapidly, like giant mutations, right? Because all variation is technically mutation. The fact that some people have, you probably hear people say that like your arm span or your wingspan, or whatever you want to call it, is like the same as your height. But in reality, that's average. Like some people actually have long arms that are several inches longer than their height. Some people have like kind of short, stubby arms that are several inches shorter. If you're drafting people for American football this time of the year, you worry about those kinds of things, right? Like long-armed people are supposed to be better playing offensive tackle, and short-armed people are supposed to be better like inside at guard or whatever. I have no idea whether that's true, but that's what I read so far.
We are Europeans, so we don't know either.
But you don't care. Well, but it would work for everyone else's football too, right? Then you worry about like relative leg length, like how much of your height is leg length and how much is not, varies between people to people. Some people long legs, some people kind of short legs. Those are all mutations. They're just kind of the small, boring variety that builds up the variation that natural selection works on. But you're probably asking about really big macro mutations, right? Like could wings evolve in a couple of generations?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I'm going to start out by saying probably no in the way of thinking, and then I'm going to go ahead and back into why you're probably not totally wrong, too. So we do know from studying bats and bat genetics that it only takes a couple of changes to some genes that are fairly high up in the sort of hierarchy of genes turning on and off to apparently go from more mouse-like proportions to more bat-like proportions. That was published a couple of years ago now, when like all the cool new breakthroughs in genetics were like big front page news, right? And now they're just kind of becoming commonplace. So they weren't really implying that like you had a rodent-like animal and maybe 2 or 3 generations later you had a bat-like animal, but probably what it does mean is if you had an early animal that had some small area of behavior, some skin in their case connecting their hands to their bodies, that relatively rapidly and maybe a couple of hundreds of generations or whatever, centuries to millennia to maybe in 500,000 years, somewhere in that range, you could evolve quite quickly if there was a strong selective pressure to get bigger aerial organs, so to speak, with your forearms. The problem with it happening super fast, like you described, is that kind of mutation is rarely integrated well into an organism. You can get macro mutations, although sometimes they're merely re-expressing routines that are supposed to otherwise be cut off in the modern animal. Like horses are often, I don't want to say often, but not infrequently born with an extra finger or two, rather than the one. Because, normally horses are flipping everyone off all the time because I guess they're giant assholes. But can I say that on the podcast?
Yeah, I'm
sure. Okay. But they do sometimes re-express one or the other two fingers around them because they actually have the genes to make those. They just have yet other genes that have evolved since then to turn those off. And sometimes mutations
they hear that, China.
Sometimes it makes that mutations they turn off the turn off gene, and then you get extra toes. A similar thing happens with like some dolphins or whales and like slightly more expressed hind legs or whatever. Heck, even today, all birds develop the placodes that could develop teeth in theory, but other genes kill those off. They have them do apoptosis when cells commit suicide because they're supposed to, according to the genes. They do that, and then they don't grow the teeth, but they have most of the routine to make really tiny little tooth buds. They just stop it, right? So you can have these, but for new features, usually you need a little bit of fine-tuning by natural selection, so probably you don't get there like just in 2 or 3 generations. It probably takes a little bit more steps than that, is my best guess.
Good guess. When we observe evolution, you look for morphological and conceptual similarities, right? And
yep.
Which one is actually more important to find the answer in the evolution?
Or between the morphological and which?
Or conceptual similarities. Like when you observe bird today, an Archaeopteryx, and some small dinosaur before Archaeopteryx, is the difference between small dinosaur and Archaeopteryx morphological and conceptual is one between today's birds and Archaeopteryx, right?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, perceptions obviously constrain how we see and interpret everything. But the morphology is the real data. It's the thing that should help hopefully correct our perceptions if they're wrong. Small feathered dinosaurs that lived alongside Archaeopteryx were almost identical to them in most ways. So in that sense, they're morphologically, like Archaeopteryx is very different from living birds. Living birds, they have a bony tail, but it's very small. And once it goes through development, it ends in a little pygostyle. And Archaeopteryx has a standard little bony dinosaur tail. Obviously, Archaeopteryx has actual teeth, and living birds, kill theirs off in development. Actually, living birds have a slightly longer tail with more vertebrae in development too, before they also kill off a bunch of those and fuse some of them into the pygostyle. It's kind of fun how you can kind of see hints of, the dinosaur as they develop in an egg. But, also some of our preconceptions about modern birds are wrong. Like, we think the idea of hands in a bird is really weird, but you can absolutely find birds today that will have little claws at the ends of where their actual hands are morphologically in the wing. I have personally had a turkey that came that way for Thanksgiving. Of course, for real, the Huan...
You shouldn't have eaten that.
Well, I didn't eat that part. The Huatzin of South America is actually born with the hands a bit more free and with extra the claws on its fingers as a juvenile, so it can climb around before then it continues the development that normally happens in the egg, and it finishes fusing up a little bit more into a more
American, so it's more free.
Yeah. And so, like all those bits of morphology are basically hidden in birds today, and sometimes not so hidden. We just don't look for them. Like, I still see people, sometimes even people on like otherwise really good YouTube channels or science blogs talking about birds' knees bending backwards. But birds' knees don't bend backwards. That's their ankles you see bending the same way your ankles bend. It's just that birds walk up on their tippy toes and their ankles are high up off the ground. They have normal knees that bend the same way yours and mine do in terms of they fold backwards, but their upper legs are so short that their knees are literally hiding underneath most of their feathers in most species, right? So you just don't see the knee, and our brain goes, oh, well, the knee must be the middle of the leg, I can see, and then we just assume it bends backwards, but they don't. Those are angles.
Interesting. I haven't thought about it. Yeah. But you mentioned earlier for the birds that species burst out even today. So is it that birds actually jump-started evolution and not that evolution jump-started the birds? If you get me.
I feel like that's kind of a more philosophical question.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, no. I see what you're getting at. Like, the explosion should be a radiation in response to opportunity, right? Evolution is always about good enough and opportunity. And so when organisms either can evolve into a new habitat that's sort of underused, we kind of see with whales and evolving into the water and stuff like that too. You can see rapid evolution that fills a lot of niches. Otherwise, to be honest, rapid evolution is often bad. Rapid evolution, like you're not moving into new underused parts of the environment, actually usually means that you're stressed. During the age of dinosaurs, the Mesozoic, there was like lizards and then a bunch of other lizard-like animals that also were there, rancosaurs at the same time. Rancocephalians, sorry. And the lizards evolved really well, and the tuatara-like relatives did poorly, but the tuatara-like relatives, if you don't know, the tuatara is a very lizard-like animal, lives in South America, but it's not a lizard. It's still alive today. It's the last of this group. But they'd evolved really faster in the Mesozoic compared to the lizards because they were being stressed by the lizards. The lizards were actually apparently doing really well, and they were struggling to, keep up, so to speak. And that led to rapid evolution, which we intuitively think should be good, but was really just a sign that they were under a lot of stress all the time. And then their rate of extinction went up until we only had a couple lineages, and now we only have the one alive today. So,
yeah. Imagine the level of stress when you see a fireball in the sky.
Right. The end of the Cretaceous, you're like, uh-oh, it's going to be a bad day for the next century.
Yeah, but we should be thankful for that, because if mass extinction of the dinosaurs didn't happen, would we actually, as humans, be here today?
No, we would not be. Yeah, absolutely. That was a good day for us. It was bad for the egg-laying mammals and probably a lot of marsupials, but the placental mammals, which had never been the most common mammals really in most of the Mesozoic, it was a good day for them ultimately. Although it probably sucked to go through it at the time, right?
Yeah.
Like several economies came out of World War II doing very good, but I don't think most of them looked at World War II and went, oh yeah, that was a good thing for us.
That's a good example. Yeah. We need to have a reboot every now and then,
Yeah, but the reboots are really kind of funny too. If you're being rebooted.
Yeah. And let's get back from the war to dinosaurs.
Yeah.
10 years ago, I would definitely not imagine T-Rex with feathers, and today I cannot unsee it. And how much do we know about that feathers actually? Was it a common for all of them later, or theropods, ceratopsians, or did all dinosaurs have it? Some form of feathers at some part of body or something?
So that's a great question, and I will tell you what I think is probably most likely, but there's definitely some debate about which groups are most likely to have what kind. I think the first statement that should be made, that it should be not controversial, is that dinosaurs show a lot of skin-based adaptations. Like, even the ones without feathers have other tchotchkes going on, weird scale shapes, larger scale shapes, armor and plates, of course. Putting various tchotchkes on your skin is a dinosaur thing. Some of those tchotchkes are insulation, some of which at some point we would call feathers. The reason this is difficult is we have a really incredibly, exceptionally good record now of winged protobird dinosaurs, theropods. But the record after, the late Jurassic, as you go older, gets rapidly much worse. And so, we're fairly sure that some sort of fur-like feather preceded more true feather-like branching structures. But we can't trace that down to the earliest theropods because we just don't have skin impressions. Now, we have some fairly primitive ornithischians, plant-eating dinosaurs, with beaks and stuff that do also have interesting structures like Calindrodromius, which definitely shows fur-like, quill-like structures, but also seems to have some over large scales, perhaps on its tail, and some other really weird sort of fused scaled feather-like structures that we just don't even see anywhere else yet. And then we don't have skin impressions for a lot of other basal ornithischians, although a group called heterodontosaurs we do, and they seem kind of fuzzy based upon the specimens we have. So it's tempting to say, well, if they're fuzzy, and we know theropods closer to birds are fuzzy and then feathery, probably the common ancestor is. And yet another group will tell you, well, yeah, that probably is true because pterosaurs, which are pretty close relatives of the dinosaurs, but not, technically dinosaurs, also have fur-like fuzz, and they look pretty similar too, so probably, primitively, they all have it, and then some lose it. But other paleontologists will be like, yeah, but no stegosaurs have fur that we found, and we have skin impressions of them, and no sauropods that we found have fur-like impressions. Even some of the baby titanosaurs with skin and eggs, that are like volleyball sized or whatever, and they have scaly skin in there. And so the question is, what the hell? Clearly, the answer appears to be that dinosaur skin was malleable. It could evolve rapidly to what was needed. Which could mean that maybe fur-like feathery kinds of scaly things evolved more than once or several times, or it could be that it really is the basal condition, which I tend to lean towards, but not super strongly, and it was just lost or reversed to scales or spikes or other things in a bunch of different critters, like early horned dinosaurs, like psittacosaurs that don't even have the horns yet, have like things on their tails, that just kind of bristles down the top of the midline, but they're scaly otherwise. It's tempting to look at slightly more advanced protoceratopsians, which have raised tails, and think, oh, probably there's a display structure on their raised tail, because why would you do that if you're not showing off? That's why I raised my tail. I'm kidding. If I were to twerk, I would probably literally do permanent damage to my back. But and then you get like the full-grown like Triceratops. We've got wonderful skin impressions, and it has like these almost Godzilla-like square-picked scales on the bottom of the neck and the belly, and then these giant dinner plate-sized scales in the back with smaller ones in between. And it looks like if somebody like purposely drew an old-fashioned skin impression, an old-timey skin mixed with monsters from the movies, and yet that's what they were. So like clearly there's huge variability in the skin.
There are no rules but one. Drink Jägermeister at minus 18 degrees Celsius.
But okay, we spoke about wings, we spoke about feathers, and our perception of it. Do we need to look at the feathers as connected to the wings for the same purpose, or it's something that should be observed differently?
That's a fair question. Part of it depends on what you want to call a feather. Like, if we know modern feathers evolved from other kinds of structures, do we want to call those feathers too, because they're what's called homologous? Or do we want to say it's connected to their shape, right? And it's worth noting that we're not consistent with this, really, even with modern birds. Like, we often just call anything on a bird a feather, and a lot of those structures are more fur-like, meaning that the shape is not necessarily important. Although in that case, someone else might tell you, well, hey, but they evolved to be simpler from more complex feathers, which is undoubtedly true. But again, if shape isn't attached, what makes a feather? I do think you need to think of feather origins as separate from wings, and especially separate from flight. But where the true rachis and barb branching upon branching kind of modern structure, where that showed up and why, and how closely related it was to flight are things that are kind of debated. It definitely looks like branching modern style feathered proto-wings showed up in animals who did not have flying ancestors. But like just below there, like ornithomimans are a type of very speedy theropod dinosaurs that kind of look like ostriches with tails stuck on them. There's been a description of them apparently developing wings when they get to be adults, meaning it probably is either for sexual display or possibly for warming nests, or of course both. But those feathers seem much less they do seem branching, but probably not like held together by little barbules and stuff the way modern feathers are. A very simpler form of feather. And do you want to call those feathers? It'd be great if they were better preserved so we could like get in with a microscope and see. But they were preserved in a sandstone, and those just don't have the sort of fine grain resolution that like some of the really fine grain mud or siltstones have in like northeastern Asia, where a lot of feathered dinosaurs come from and stuff. So I would say, yeah, we need to separate feathers from wings and from flight personally, because they probably had so many purposes beforehand, keeping animals warm, showing off, etc., while acknowledging that at some point the fully modern aerodynamic rachis and barbed and barbuled modern feathers probably evolved much closer to flight.
Yeah, let me ask you this. I think it's an important question to always ask a paleontologist. Cold-blooded or warm-blooded dilemma with dinosaurs. What's your take?
Sure. I definitely come down to the warm-blooded side of that, but to put some nuance into that, I don't think actually a lot of non-bird dinosaurs were up in the placental mammal, deer, cat, range, or the certainly not up in the upper flying bird range, which tends to be even higher than placental mammals a lot of the time. One of the real problems here, I think, is that our conceptions don't match up with the actual sort of data for like basal metabolic rate across organisms. A lot of people think that like, there's this huge gap between like the animals we call warm-blooded and the animals we call cold-blooded, and therefore people will be like, well, maybe dinosaurs were in between. But the reality is that like the mammals with the lowest metabolic rates are barely higher than the lizards with the highest ones, because not all lizards have the exact same one and not all mammals do. So like egg-laying mammals have relatively low metabolism. Sloths, some sloths can't even regulate their body temperature. If they get too high, they just get too cold and they have to stop and turn around, which maybe isn't surprising because if you've ever seen them, they don't go anywhere fast, right?
Yeah.
Kiwi birds from New Zealand also have like metabolic rates down with marsupials, which again are lower than they are in like you and I and cats and dogs and cows and elephants and such. And so if birds and mammals are warm-blooded, that's actually the vast majority of all metabolic rates that vertebrates use, right? The things that like lizards and amphibians use is much smaller, and it gets up to almost the bottom of the range of the mammals of the lowest metabolic rates. Well, nobody really believes that dinosaurs had lizard-like metabolic rates anymore. They grew faster, they walked upright, they show evidence of high oxygen consumption. So by definition, if they're not in that group and there's no real room in between, then they're warm-blooded. They're in that group that mammals and birds inhabit. But that doesn't mean that they're way up where hummingbirds are or even necessarily where elephants are. There's still quite a bit of room in that marsupial kiwi bird range, where they'd be warm-blooded by all traditional uses of the word, but not necessarily as high as, a penguin. And I think that's where a lot of the non-bird ones are going to probably fall in. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. People who look at growth rates have implied that their growth rates are definitely higher than lizards, but not maybe as high as, the fastest growing of like birds and mammals, etc. Some of the paleothermometry, which is kind of what it sounds like, where you use chemical proxies and isotopes to figure out like the temperatures, or at least the range of temperatures in life, have suggested that some dinosaurs, the big ones especially, are pretty high, but a lot of the medium-sized ones have sort of more greater ranges of body temperatures than like you would at a similar size. So again, tighter than you'd see in a Komodo dragon or a lizard of our size, but smaller than like a placental mammal or a crow.
And we mentioned, I have to ask you this, we mentioned pterosaurs earlier, and they are not dinosaurs. But how intertwined is the evolution of pterosaurs and dinosaurs? Because when I was a kid, it was simple for me. Birds came from pterosaurs, lizards came from dinosaurs. But is there any cause and effect relationship in the evolution chart of them or not?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Pterosaurs, according to almost all workers, are basically the sister group of dinosaurs, just about. I mean, there's a few little other dinosaur morphs and forms that go around them or whatever. But in terms of major clades that you'll see in a kid's book, pterosaurs are about the closest relatives of dinosaurs that you're going to find in your average Barnes and Noble fourth grade, first book of fossils or whatever.
Yeah.
Although why people wait in fourth grade to get books on fossils? Anyways, that's way too long. So yeah, they're really close relatives. They probably evolved just slightly before the dinosaurs, but right in the same range of when dinosaurs evolved in the Triassic. And they definitely coexisted in all major ecosystems, right? Later on, some of the biggest pterosaurs probably hunted small or juvenile dinosaurs, like Quetzalcoatlus and stuff. So they're absolutely intertwined. But like the exact roles, like can we see dinosaurs changing because of pterosaurs is a thing that hasn't really been attacked, and it's not a thing that I can point to offhand and say that's definitely a case. It's a really interesting question, though. Some have suggested the reverse. Some have suggested that the evolution of flying dinosaurs, birds, may have impacted pterosaurs. Pterosaurs become, on average, larger and perhaps less common as you go through the Cretaceous. Certainly nothing that themselves look like they're going extinct, but of course big animals are more susceptible to extinction because they reproduce slower, have smaller populations. So in theory, the argument goes they could have been indirectly impacted, but there are several pterosaur workers who've done studies that would argue vociferously that isn't really the cause and effect going on there, and there's other patterns that pterosaurs were doing quite well until the impact at the end of the Cretaceous. So, but maybe.
Yeah. Maybe it's the right answer for everything. Yeah.
Well, and I should know crocodiles are much closer to dinosaurs and pterosaurs than lizards are. Lizards are actually really far away from them. Lizards are almost as far away as you can be from dinosaurs without it being closer to mammals.
Yeah.
I mean, they are still closer, but if you get many more branches away, you're going to be on a different part of the tree than being a diapsid. So, yeah.
I mentioned in crocodiles. Let me ask you about Spinosaurus. When I see Spinosaurus, I think big alligator. And I saw on the internet that discoveries were made recently, and that paleontologists think that it had dense bones, and which allowed him to dive deep and hunt underwater. And then I saw on your website 4 articles about Spinosaurus. So what's your expert take about?
Sure. Well, I want to first acknowledge the still fairly decent degree of uncertainty here with the Spinosaurus fossils themselves. Like, we really having an even more complete specimen from a single individual bone bed, or perhaps if a lot more specimens are brought out eventually of the bone bed where the recent Spinosaurus is coming from, to where we can have more confidence in all of the bones going where they think they do, that'll really help. I have been, as you know, a bit more skeptical than some on the idea that Spinosaurus was truly an aquatic marine dinosaur. It clearly was eating fish often, as were all Spinosaur relatives. But the thing is, we know other Spinosaur relatives were eating fish, but were not particularly adapted to being swimming in the water crocodile-like. They were perhaps wading through the water or wading along shorelines. There's a lot of ways you can patrol water, right? And even today, birds do it lots of ways. Now, the density question is interesting. I'm going to hold my opinion on that until maybe we see some follow-ups on it. Some mammal workers think that pachyostosis, the degree to which the bones are heavier than normal, can be misleading as an indicator of what they do. But it's not so much that the density question is wrong, it's what do you interpret it? Hippos clearly spend a lot of time in the water, and they have very dense, heavy bones, but they don't actually eat in the water unless they catch an unlucky bird floating on top. They actually come out at night and do all of their grazing on land. Water buffalo also have relatively dense bones, can absolutely walk through rivers where they're basically up to their heads or holding their breaths. But nobody thinks of water buffalo as aquatic particularly, right? They are obviously very terrestrial and also like the mud and being around water when they can be. Moose spend almost as much time in the water in some areas as water buffalo do. Nobody thinks of moose as particularly right aquatic, even though with their big spreading feet, they are quite good at going across soft, pliable surfaces, big spreading hooved feet. So, like, I don't think anyone is denying that Spinosaurus was in and around the water and that it was eating fish. Although, like an 800-pound gorilla, it probably also ate whatever it wanted.
Yeah.
But I know I and several other colleagues still question just what the degree of true semi-aquatic or aquaticness was. The idea that it was a pursuit swimming predator seems unlikely. They're missing most of the adaptations you see in animals like that. So I tend to think of it as more of a wader, type of animal. But it's not impossible some of these animals got good at being able to sort of just hang out in deeper water and then come back up. I still don't think they're swimming after things, but to get down and come back up, maybe. I'd love to know the proportions better. I know I'm still a bit skeptical of all the bones coming out with the new Spinosaurus going together, specifically with the couple of dorsals that came out separately that were collected and sold privately to another museum. Definitely going with the rest of it. The rest of it clearly goes together. It definitely, had a pelvis and the legs and the tail. And the tail definitely also has a sail on it. It doesn't look like a terribly good swimming tail to me, actually, because it's asymmetrical. But it's got a frill on the top, but short chevrons on the bottom, which animals that swim usually have a much more symmetrical tail, because always you induce torque when you swim, and then you use muscle power to, avoid that, and that's not efficient, and inefficiency starves you. Also, the big sail on the back of it would be kind of shit underwater.
Not practical.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a pursuit predator, if you're just hanging out, fine, no problem at all. Maybe throws shade and attracts fish. I don't know. Those are all fine, again. So it's not, I feel like the disagreements are getting smaller and smaller. Clearly it's an animal spending a lot of time around the water. I definitely doubt it was quadrupedal, walking on four legs. There's no real reason that any theropods look like they'd be good at that. But who knows? We don't have very good arms yet. It would help to have better ones. And I do question whether the torso is quite as long relative to the hips and the tail until such time as we get more good vertebrae out of that quarry. And then, if they are that size, so be it. So yeah, I guess that's my answer, is we still need to wait and see a bit. I think it is easy to get carried away by what an awesome image of proto-whale dinosaur would be, because that's kind of what it would be doing if it followed the original, science description. And that would be awesome. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I don't think the evidence is that extraordinary quite yet for that model.
But it definitely didn't look like in Jurassic Park.
No, unfortunately that's gone. Even if they're still pretty clearly two-legged and stuff, they're gonna not look like that. Yo.
I have one more question. During your career, during your research, what would you characterize as your eureka moment?
That's hard. So much of science that becomes big doesn't start with eureka moments. It starts with, oh, that's funny moments instead.
Yeah. Small steps.
Yeah, right. Small steps that only add up to being big later. I used to be a big advocate of the whole flight was very early, trees down sort of secondary flightless model of feathered dinosaurs. And I only slowly gave that up as, I started looking at the phylogenetics of how it worked and the practicality of how it worked. So there wasn't a eureka moment there where I flipped. It just, the comparative anatomy stopped adding up to that story and the phylogenetics didn't support it. And eventually you have to go, oh, well, I guess not then. I will say, and this is only recently come out in my more recent and dense papers on reconstructing environments and physiological modeling. A eureka moment wasn't any of those findings per se. Well, it sort of was, but I can't talk about that one because it's not published yet. But realizing the value of large data sets and modeling and being able to ask questions that you can't just ask by looking at individual fossils was kind of a eureka moment. When I came to and joined the research group in the geosciences department, the paleobiology group at UW-Madison, seeing that work was kind of like oh man, we have been missing the boat by not doing this more with dinosaurs and the Mesozoic in general. So maybe that's as close as I can give you. Don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but it's an honest one.
Yeah. Okay, we have a little tradition for the end. We have the quote on our language and we translate it into English, and Luca prepared the quote for this episode.
Okay. So the quote is from our, it's not exactly Montenegro writer, but from this region, Ivo Andrić, who is our only Nobel winner. And he said, he wrote about the past and history, and he wrote this on our language. Tako sve češće u sadašnjosti vidim prošlost, a u prošlost sadašnjost. Sve brže prelazim put od jedne do druge, sve lakše iz njih vidim budućnost. I sve više mi i prošlost i sadašnjost i budućnost postaju jedan jedini beskrajni pokret života. And on English, it would say, and just like that, more often I find myself seeing past in the present, and present in the past. I cross the path from one to the other quickly, and there I see the future. And more as I look, the past, the present, and the future become one, single, endless moment of life.
And that's your inspiration to start learning Montenegrin language.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity and for this fun 1 hour of dinosaur talk.
And good luck to your student that you're going to meet now.
Yeah, I love the you wish luck. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed being had. Wait, that doesn't sound good. No, I really appreciate it, though. Thank you for the excellent questions. This has been a good conversation.
We stay genuine, uncensored, and unscripted, and we always will, as we have to order our usual. Share us and subscribe us, and stay tuned until the next Wednesday. Ikuzo!